Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Joel Hunter, the host of Power Talks, empowering you through the voice of truth. And on today's program, we're going to talk about sexual harassment. Now, just a heads up, if you have young people in the room, it may get uncomfortable, so we just wanted you to understand that. I have a great panel today, all of them friends of mine, and to my immediate left is Mark Najim. Mark is a community leader and activist. He's often on the 50 Most Powerful in Orlando list. He is the establisher of Najim Law, one of the most prestigious law firms in town and in the state, actually. All his career has fought for equality and fairness and rights for who we used to call the underdogs. And in in May of 2018, he's going to be launching a worldwide social media platform called Faith Social that will network the Christian communities all over the world. Next to him is Judy Douglas, who is a speaker, an author, an encourager, and an activist, quite frankly. She directs the Women's Resources for Cru, Campus Crusade International, and works in leadership there with her husband, Steve, who happens to be the president of Campus Crusade International. And she has signed on to a statement of national Christian women leaders called Silence is Not Spiritual. And so we will be talking with her about that. David Haas was for 5 years a state prosecutor and for 10 years a federal prosecutor. And so I wanted to invite him on to kind of give us the prosecutorial, how are you legally liable in cases like this? Like, what's the legal definition? Let me tell you where we're going. When many of us heard about the disastrous news of the Me Too movement, so many cases of sexual harassment, those of us who are huggers thought, am I in trouble? Did I make somebody feel uncomfortable? So the first thing we want to do is kind of establish legally what really is sexual harassment. But then we want to go to more the personal and spiritual side as well. And that is, how can power sometimes inadvertently be coercive? And what can we do to really solve this problem and this dilemma? How can we address it? So David, let me go to you first. For those people who just wonder, okay, legally speaking, who's liable? What is prosecutable? Can you give us just a brief kind of...
Absolutely. There's going to be two kinds in a more traditional sexual harassment workplace type of setting. The first is going to be if there's a hostile work environment that's created by something that just permeates into everything that goes along. Then the second way is going to be whether there's some sort of...
Would that be like making crude jokes and that kind of thing?
It is, but more all the time. Something that's just going to happen and happen and happen so that it makes it almost difficult to even do your work.
Okay.
The other kind is the quid pro quo, something in exchange for something.
Yeah.
That's really where you see the power come into play, where somebody says you're either going to get advanced, you're going to get the raise, you're going to get the nice office, as long as you do X, Y, and Z for me. And really, when you get into the legal definition, sort of to simplify it the best, you're talking about something that's unwanted or non-consensual. And that's difficult because the person perpetrating the issue doesn't necessarily know it's not wanted until after the fact. And so they're difficult cases in that sense because they're tough to prove, and a lot of times they don't happen around witnesses.
Okay. Mark, you have kind of fought for the underdog and the folks that are being preyed upon by power. But what is the responsibility of those who are beginning to feel uncomfortable and may be subjected to either their bosses or someone who has authority over them, like what is their responsibility to speak up?
Well, it often just simply depends upon the environment. And if I could add one thing to what Dave said, though, as we segue into that, it's usually an ongoing pattern, creating a hostile work environment, as Dave said. But it can be a mere comment. If you end up saying to a woman, you women are not competent to do any of this, or you're terrible, men can do this much better than you. You don't need to keep saying that. If you mock somebody's sexuality, or you're calling them defamatory names, derogatory names, you can create that hostile work environment, because then what do? If your boss or a superior says that to you, then you're now stuck with that situation. And it's much akin, it was all passed under the same Civil Rights Act in 1964, but it'd be no different than commenting about somebody's race, and then commenting about the inequality because somebody would be bigoted and comment about that. So it can be created. So that then segues, if it's an ongoing pattern, inappropriate jokes, off-color jokes that make people uncomfortable. You need to go to your HR director. If you don't have an HR director, then you need to go to the boss. However, if it's the boss doing it, then what do you do? And the thing that everybody needs to remember, though, because they're afraid of losing their job or they're losing their career or their status, you cannot retaliate. So if in fact one gets fired or demoted or shunned because of bringing this up, there's a retaliatory lawsuit that they have against their employer. So when you bring it up, the worst thing that an employer can typically do is to say you're out of here, because that only brings another claim against them typically. That's
one of the things we're going for in this discussion is what is really actionable. First of all, what can you get in trouble for saying you look pretty today? Wow, nice dress, not that you should do that, but every once in a while we say, boy, you look nice today. And you go, is that, or is it something, has to be something much more suggestive or much more leading than that? And if that kind of comment is taken as, oh my goodness, I wonder what he wants, I need to go to the HR person to see, how do you navigate that?
They're tough. It's a subjective evaluation. It's not really a strict objective evaluation where you can't say somebody's pretty. I think you look great today, incidentally. Oh, but the fact is that I'm a hugger.
I am so suing you.
And as you're good luck.
No, you're right.
But I'm a hugger. You're a hugger.
Yeah.
I happen to know a very successful business person in town who now walks around with an attendant because he or she is not going to hug anybody so that no accusations could be made. And that's unfortunate, but it's dangerous out there.
Yeah.
And so in our office, we choose to keep it a little bit more open. Is there a risk associated? Yeah, but there's also, you want it to have a nice a feeling of camaraderie within the workplace.
Yeah.
And so merely telling somebody you look very nice today is not necessarily standing alone inappropriate. If that person makes a complaint and you do it again, it's inappropriate.
Okay.
So sometimes it's just using good common sense, but the reality of it is dangerous out there, and things have changed. And there are times if you say it to somebody, you mean it. Other people, it really is a sexual come on. So within what context is it taken?
That's a good point. Judy, let's go from the legal to the more personal and spiritual. Right on the heels of the Me Too movement came the Church Too movement.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of reports of sexual impropriety, sexual coercion in religious institutions, many of whom, to our great shame, had a record of turning aside or siding with the persecutor. Could you just speak to that? Just not only what are the, as a woman, what are the more personal reflections, but as a Christian leader, someone who has signed the Silence is Not Spiritual statement, what would we like to say to the faith community?
Well, first of all, we need to say it's been going on a long time. And we're grateful for Me Too and then Church Too to come out so that people are aware. I was with some women yesterday telling them asking for prayer for today, and they just were kind of shocked because I said goes on in churches, it goes on in schools. You talk about mission schools around the world. You talk about Christian institutions, of which I'm a part, and it's more evident, more aware that it's happening, the more there can be an address to that. The issue is primarily one of power. Women especially, it happens to children who have no power. It happens sometimes to men, but mostly it happens to young women and young adult women. And it's a matter of, in the church, in the spiritual environment, they are told to be nice, to be quiet, that women mostly don't have a voice, and so they don't think they can speak up. And when someone who is a spiritual leader comes to them and requests or requires some kind of sexual activity, they feel like they have to. And, the question is, why don't they stand up? Why don't they speak for themselves and say no? Well, partly because they've been told they don't get to stand up and speak for themselves, but partly because they're afraid. This is my spiritual leader, and I need to do what he says.
What would you say to them? If you were looking at a young girl right now who could or had been put in a situation where she was being coerced or commanded to do something that made her uncomfortable, what would you say to her?
Well, I would say you don't have to do that. You can stand up. You can say, no, this person does not rule your life. And for some younger ones especially, they would question that because they've been told in a lot of situations that the spiritual leaders do rule their lives in a lot of ways. But no, they have a voice and they have a right to not submit to that kind of coercion. But unfortunately, you don't know a lot ahead of time to tell them that because you don't know they're going to encounter it.
Let's reverse it, though. I'm going to stay with you just one more second. What would you say to the spiritual leaders of our religious institutions in light of how much of this has come out? What would you say to those people who are powerful images spiritually?
Don't do it. It's wrong, and they will almost always, if it comes out, which the normal response to if it comes out is silence it, push it down. And that happens with individuals, it happens with organizations, it happens with whole groups of spiritual groups that are kind of together, and they come around each other and say, oh no, this isn't a church thing, when in reality it's a legal thing, and especially perpetration on children or younger women who don't have the right to say, they can't be coerced legally. And
one of the things that I'm thinking also, and David, I want to come back to you in just a second because I know Mark's got daughters. Do you have daughters?
2 daughters.
Okay, 2 daughters. Okay, I want to get to the daughter thing. But one of the things, I was a pastor for 47 years, and when a pastor hears something of this nature or an elder in a church or whatever, they worry about the very wrong things. They worry about the budget. They worry about, is this going to embarrass the church? Is this going to lose us members and all of that kind of stuff?
And it might.
Yeah, and it might, and it will. But the question is, what does power do? Does power gather its resources to preserve itself, or does power do what God did in Jesus, and that is come down, take on the form of a servant, and always be for the person who needs you most? Let me go to the daughter thing. Both of you guys got daughters. What are you saying to your daughters?
Have a voice. And, even if I had sons, it'd be the same thing, because I don't want to get sort of pigeonholed into it just happens to girls or to women, because that's not true. But to my girls, it's always important that they speak up and that they're not controlled, that they control themselves and their own voice. Yeah. And if they don't, nobody else will.
Yeah. See, I'm a part of the old line thinking, that thinks automatically this is always all about girls, but it's not all. No. Our society is so hypersexualized right now that all variations of not just sexual experimentation, but sexual pressure is on our young people, especially, who are trying to figure out who in the world they are.
Well, made much worse by the prevalence of pornography online.
That's something else we need to talk about. But first of all, Mark, what?
Yeah, but these are not so simple. I was reading today before we came in. I was catching up on the morning news, and the Olympian Simone Biles, our gold medalist, a dynamic, powerful young woman, is one of the 200 or so that the United States gymnast doctor has molested. Yeah. Here you have a bright, intelligent, articulate, poised, dynamic, driven, strong young woman who only came out recently about her being sexually molested. It's not, you can't say to a molester, well, you can say just don't molest, and some will have their moral compass guide them to get the help that they need. Most don't. It's a horrific statistic in America that at least 1 out of every 4 women have been sexually molested. Right. At least 1 out of 4. And so just to simply say, come out, be strong, report it, it's not so easy. We have to stop the shame-based responses.
The shame is
I was
a
reading
major
the
part
comments today, and when Simone, well, why didn't she just come out? And it's almost faulting the victim. And when we have that mentality, that keeps people buried even more because they're going to be judged. And unless you've been molested, and unless you really become articulate and intelligent and learned on the issue, there is a whole dynamic, a psychological, emotional shattering, and a dynamic that occurs with sex abuse victims. Yeah. And so just to simply make it so simplistic, well, come out and say something doesn't do service to those who've been offended, and it only enables those perpetrators because they know that people are siding with them. And one last point that we talked about. These are the most difficult type of cases. In our careers, in my career, I've seen more innocent people get falsely accused for sex-related cases and more guilty people get off, than any other type of case. And why is that? Because it's almost always a he said, she said. And you can have the same set of facts and go before one jury, they acquit, and another jury convicts. And so it's not such a clean line standard that we can apply. We just have to be more aware and more sensitive and be more enlightened about the whole dynamics that address sexual abuse.
Judy, you lit up when he mentioned the word shame.
Well, it's almost always a shaming that puts it down. It's like, what were you wearing that this happened? And how did you respond to him? And so it almost always, especially spiritual arenas, that it's a shame-based and
what'd you do to bring it on?
That you were the one who was at fault. And I just was reading a recent case that's come to light, and it was the same thing. It was like, well, she participated. Well, she participated because he told her she had to, and he was her leader. And what happens is the perpetrators often in the spiritual arena are really sorry because they realize, I shouldn't have done this. But the last thing they want is for it to come out. And so they are concerned about their reputation. And then their leaders are concerned about the institutions And then they're all concerned about God's reputation.
Yeah.
This will hurt the Christian community if this comes out. I think God can handle his reputation.
God can handle it. That's right.
And it's all there for, so let's be quiet, let's handle it internally, even though there are legal things that need to be addressed, and the law enforcement should be involved, not in every one of them, but in some of them.
Isn't it interesting that in the Christian tradition, the devil, Satan, the name for him is accuser. And he operates, there's legitimate guilt, that people should have, but there's this shame that people don't need to carry around and shouldn't carry around, because it isolates you, it paralyzes you. And so if people are feeling shame, they need to know that's not from God. They need to know that they are people of worth and dignity. And if they don't bring these things out, nothing gets fixed. Nothing gets better. Nobody gets healed.
And the complicating factor I see with that is, and this is the lawyer, is you have a lot of non-disclosure agreements that get written into these settlements where you have time after time, and nobody except those in power continue to know about it or know that anything happens. And those, from a public standpoint, I think you're going to start to see sort of a paradigm shift in that these are not going to be sealed anymore, and that people, women, men, are going to be allowed to talk about what happened. And that the shame should shift to the correct person that should carry the shame instead of the victim of the abuse.
There is no such thing as painless damage. The whole idea, I'd like to talk a little bit more about these non-disclosure, these settlements that we keep hearing about. We hear about them in Congress. We hear about them in cases of Hollywood and these actors that people have been paid not to say anything. That's a Faustian bargain. That is, you're selling your soul for your silence there.
It's always happened, and it will always continue to happen. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that it's not going to continue to happen. But just like so many other inequalities in society, those with wealth can typically buy silence. Those without a voice remain voiceless. And so if you've got the ability to pay, and there's something people need to understand. There's a difference between sexual harassment and sexual battery. Sexual battery is a criminal offense. Sexual harassment is a civil offense. Sexual battery not only is criminal, but you can sue somebody for the personal injury, the damage that you just, in fact, referenced, the emotional and physical damage that might attend that. But you're not allowed to threaten criminal prosecution for a civil settlement. That's extortion. So if somebody's had a point where they've now been accused, their lawyer will now go negotiate with the victim's lawyer and say, we'll settle this case for $100,000 or whatever the amount of money is. And that is what gets sealed. Now, a prosecutor, if they find out about it, can go still prosecute. They're not bound by that civil agreement. But usually there is a understanding that if you are paying and you're settling the civil case, that nobody's going to make any other forward advancements to law enforcement, and hence they go away. And then the victim at least has some money to get help and can move forward and doesn't get the public shaming. And so it's not so simple. They are inextricably intertwined with the criminal allegation and the civil allegation when there's those type of settlements.
It's really important to us as folks to realize that this outing is going to cause a great deal of pain, both to perpetrator and to victim. But my old granddaddy used to say when he applied methylate to a cut, Joey, if it doesn't sting, it ain't helping.
You might want to explain what methylate is.
Oh, methylate.
Yeah, I was going to say, they won't know what that is, Joel.
Alcohol-based stinging medicine that was orange at the time. But good catch. Well, let me wind this up here. Many of us worship the God who gave up power to come down in the form of a servant. And that really begs the question, those of us who have power, and that would be all of you, how are you going to use it? You can use it one of three ways. You can either exploit and coerce or try to get your way at someone else's expense. Or you can use your power simply to ignore problems and go on your merry way and live your life in isolation and pleasure. Or you can use your power in order to stand with those who have been victimized. And we would submit to you that the latter is really the way that Scripture recommends. It says in Proverbs 14:31, whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. That's not just money statement. That's a statement in terms of the world's circumstances and in terms of honoring and giving dignity to people. So I really want to thank you all. This has been very encouraging, very educational. Not many of us know about the legal end of things, but also very freeing conversation. Because when you know the truth, it sets you free. Somebody really great once said that. And so I want to thank all of the panelists, and Mark and Judy and David, thank you for what you've given to us on Power Talks.
Thank you.
Remember, these discussions are just that. They're discussions among us. We'd love to see you continue the discussions at home and go one step farther. Get involved, because power talks. You are empowered through the voice of truth. See you next time.